Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where you are on planet Earth, this fast forward planet, this tumultuous pandemic wrapped planet, full of stress and frontiers and clarity. We're in a pandemic. Social distancing matters, masks matter, but also deep uncertainty and complexity. I think complexity actually is the biggest challenge. Because everything's interlaced. Sometimes it feels like we're in a landscape of tripwires and landmines with no map, and they're all interconnected. So you push on one thing and it creates stress in another place. This is Andy Revkin. I'm a longtime journalist. I've been at Columbia now, University at the Earth Institute for about a year, which feels like 3 weeks and feels like a century in other ways. And I'm trying to build an initiative on communication and sustainability. And this has evolved such that Monday sessions, I call Thriving Online, and really should have like a yes, really, after it. They're really on skill building and skill sharing, and how can we make information matter, and connections matter in ways that can be applied widely. Today, I'm really pleased to be with a couple of colleagues who I've only met in recent months and who are working not in the journalism school, not in the communication universe, but in social work in one case and in the School of the Arts in the other. Desmond Yu Patton, associate professor at the School of Social Work, is a real pioneer in looking at data and looking at how gangs and youth who are low income and of color what's the landscape like for them in terms of the online media landscape, and how does that relate to getting things done in the real world to cut risk and boost opportunity for those among us who are least empowered. And Lance Weiler is a digital pioneer who you'll hear more. You just go to digitalstorytellinglab.com and you can learn a lot more. He's been working at widening the interface of what we think story is and how that can be experienced in multidimensional ways beyond words or images or even moving images, which are the traditions we've all lived with. And we're going to have a little brisk conversation here about their work and their frontiers, and then what might be applied from what they do to a wider landscape of risks and areas that I think about all the time, where the missing element seems to be either a better conversation or just access to information. This is from wildfire risk to flooding to COVID-19 itself. You know, we're surrounded by information, but so much of it is not getting to the right place or not being received in a way that's useful. You're going to see so much more of this. So Desmond Patton and Lance Weiler, it's great to have you here.
Thank you for having us.
And yeah, thank you.
So I like to just start by saying, how are you doing? You both are living lives that are significantly online. That doesn't mean that your lives weren't upended by what's happened. But maybe we'll start with Lance. You've been at Columbia since, well, maybe almost a decade. Is that right? Or is it longer?
I started at Columbia in about 2011. It's so almost a decade. Yeah.
Yeah. And it probably feels like a longer time or a shorter time, or both?
Oh, a mixture. I think it just depends when. I mean, right now, everything just feels very, time just is difficult to determine at the moment. But
yeah.
But I have loved my time at Columbia, and it's been a really wonderful experience thus far. But yeah, I started in 2011 as an adjunct professor, and then in 2013 started the Digital Storytelling Lab, and now I'm an associate professor in film and theater at the School of the Arts.
And do you interface much with, let's say, the journalism school?
Yes, I do. In fact, we have a new project that we just received a magic grant for, which is around deep fakes and fake news, and it's kind of around misinformation and deception. In addition to that, have done a lot of work at different times with both the Brown Institute in the past and also some other parts of the journalism school. So tend to interface with them and numerous schools across campus.
So Deepfake, maybe a brief thought on this Deepfake project. Yeah, and the Brown Institute for Media Innovation is a great hub. We're working with them too on climate and resilience. How do you drive a better community decision making and community resilience through using data in creative ways. It's a cool place.
I think all three of us have a connection to the Brown Institute. Yes, because I know Desmond does as well. Yeah.
We'll learn about that from Desmond too.
Yeah.
I'm a big fan. It's the one place, well, I'm not going to disparage the rest of the journalism school. I went there in 1981, 82, when we still had typewriters and when cutting and pasting was actually cutting and pasting. The paper was like blue, light blue. Anyway, lots of change, but Brown Institute particularly feels kind of like pushing the edges. So Desmond,
yeah,
School of Social Work. I love what is being done there generally. I came late to the School of Social Work through the work of Courtney Coburn and you and others. It's not historically a place that a journalist like thinks of turning. Well, I need to interview someone from the School of Social Work, but the more I've dug in on what you do, it's so interfaced with, again, community resilience or all the issues that I've dealt with as a journalist over the decades seem highly salient.
Yeah, I feel like that's a common issue, is that folks don't look to social work for thought around the most critical social issues of our day, and that's exactly what we do. So if you're interested in conversations around poverty and community resiliency or violence or domestic violence or mental health and health, that is the School of Social Work. That is the makeup of a social work school.
And can you describe, you call yourself a public interest technologist, which I really like that, but I wanted to hear more.
Yeah, I mean, I call myself a lot of things, right? So I would say my first identity is a social worker. But as a social worker, I work in this applied setting as a public interest technologist because I'm interested in how we leverage social work thinking in terms of, humanistic practices and inclusive practices. How do we leverage that in the development and integration of technologies? And so in my lab, the SAFE lab, we spend a lot of time thinking about inclusion. We think about ethics and humanity, whose voices are being censored, who's not being censored, and why. And what can we do about that? How might we leverage big data, soft data, thick data, communication, social media to really rethink how we do interventions and prevention practices in social work, and how can we apply that to technology spaces?
And what's an early example? Like, what got you excited about this as an actual prospect?
Yeah, I would have to say I came to technology through youth. So as I mentioned before, I'm a social worker, and my focus has always been youth and gang violence. And so I did my dissertation in Chicago, where I studied high-achieving Black boys who were excelling academically, but living in one of the most violent neighborhoods in Chicago. And one of the things that kept coming up in our conversations was the issue of Twitter, and how Twitter became this space where they could share their lives with other people, or they could share music and build community and connections. This is around 2011, where when Twitter was very popular in the Black community, Black youth in particular, but also a space where they would have to navigate violence, where it would be a place where they would identify safe and unsafe locations, and also a space where violence could be amplified through aggression or kind of clear threats towards rival groups. But most importantly, and what I've been most interested in most recently, is social media as a space for processing trauma and grief, and its ability to either help that process or hinder that process through its features.
That what you just said about that early use of Twitter as both amplifying or avoiding violence sort of speaks to so many technologies, right? It's for better or worse.
Absolutely. Because I think that it is this very complicated window into our world, right? So we can see and hear and watch so many nuanced and complicated conversations unfold that have direct impact on our lives, but it can in turn also be the very tool that is the problem with why we receive violence or experience violence as well.
And Lance, getting to your lab, and I assume you grew up mostly in the 20th century, kind of like me. I'm 64. I might be older than you are, but
Yeah, you're a
most
little
of my
older.
experience was in the 20th century, and film and TV were unilateral, outward broadcasting things. Games became that experiential navigating process. Some, immersive games, role playing games, and like. But what got you convinced that there's gaps that needed filling that created this lab?
Well, I think in some respects, there's been a permission-based culture that's been around storytelling for quite some time, and you saw that open up a bit with social media and the way that anybody could basically publish and put things into the world. And I think I found myself kind of constrained by certain traditional platforms and running times, and became more interested in this idea of kind of embracing those formerly known as the audience, and what was it like to actually have large collaborations globally with people, and what if we could take story, which is basically we use narratives to understand our world, right? We use stories to understand who we are and our relationship to those things around us in the world, and just wondered what would it be like to kind of marry emerging technology with storytelling, design thinking, play, and speculative design. And so the lab really kind of embraces this notion of experience design at its core. How can we kind of create immersive learning experiences? And so the lab looks and says, and explores new forms and functions of storytelling, in the sense that a function might be something like artificial intelligence or the Internet of Things or AR or VR, augmented reality, virtual reality. And then, in terms of, I'm sorry, that's the form. In terms of the function, it might be using storytelling for healing, or using it for learning, or using it for policy change, or using it to mobilize, or using it for entertainment. And so within the lab, we really lean into collaborative practice quite a bit. And some of the work that we do is about demystifying the process of emergent technologies. We really feel that there needs to be as many voices as possible in the mix in terms of when technology is shaped or designed. And classically, a lot of the technology that we're working with currently has been shaped by engineers, and has come out of a narrative that has been developed by Silicon Valley, which is very much about capitalism and about users and all the terminology that's associated with it. And so we're interested in this notion of, well, what if we can bring humanity to the table, and what might those technological solutions look like if more people were involved in actually shaping them? And so often a lot of the work that the lab does is very difficult to kind of almost wrap your head around. I often feel like I'm kind of in some ways from the future. I'm talking about things that people are like, well, I'm not really sure what that means. And okay, I get it kind of abstractly. But when people come and engage in some of the things that we do, they gain a little bit more of an insight into what we're working on. But a lot of it is kind of predicated on this idea of embracing ambiguity, embracing uncertainty, trying to find ways that you can navigate complexity with groups of people. And in some cases that, deals with bridging polarizing issues. It deals with maybe at times having difficult conversations, but also on the other side of it, allowing people to realize that they can tell stories, and that they can be part of these larger narratives, and that we don't necessarily have to be, like, I love this quote, I'm paraphrasing, by Buckminster Fuller, that we can be, we don't have to be victims of the future. We can be architects of it. And I think a lot of what the lab tries to do is tries to explore these speculative spaces. We did it with Frankenstein AI, which was very much a project about kind of looking at Mary Shelley's original work and doing a retelling of it, and casting kind of artificial intelligence as the as the creature effectively, and kind of looking and saying, wow, that's a really wonderful metaphor, because that book is really about like creating something in it, getting out of its control, but at the same time it's about isolation and connection. At the same time it's about the other. And so there's really all these wonderful things kind of wrapped up in that book. And what if you could do an adaptation and use emergent technology and allow people to interface with it in a way that was unexpected? And so a lot of times we'll do experimentation like that. So
that relates a little bit to what I've heard from Desmond as well about, also the full access idea, making this an immersive, truly inclusive experience. So it's again, it's not just for technologists. It's technologists or communicators or university enabling creating a platform, like a menu and a platform and an experimentation space. So you both are involved with some of these summer. Desmond, did you just like wrap up a summer program, AI for All?
I did, yeah. So this is one of the connections that I have with Lance. And so a couple of years ago, I applied for a Magic Grant at the Brown Institute as well. And we received that grant to start the Digital Scholars Lab, which was intended to be a 6-week program for youth of color in the city to learn more about technology. So to really disrupt that pipeline of folks of color entering tech space, but to also consider the cultural challenges that happen once you enter a tech space as well. And so Lance was instrumental in helping us to develop that program and offered some modules for our students as well. During that first year, we had someone from the AI for All program out of Oakland come and speak to our young people. And they were like, hey, like, why doesn't this become an AI for All program at Columbia? And so we did another iteration of the Digital Scholars Lab for year 2. And then in our third year, we became the AI for All summer program at Columbia that I co-direct with August and Chantrell. And we just did our year 2 all virtual. So we had 16 youth of color from all over the US this year working with us. And what was really magical about that experience is that, they really trusted this virtual environment as a place where they could do some dynamic learning. We had a host of diverse folks who approached technology from an interdisciplinary lens. And so we didn't have a lot of computer scientists. We had policy folks and artists and user researchers and social workers all coming at technology from the particular lens. And that was really exciting for our young people.
There's some questions that have come in. There's someone with the YouTube named Science Cathedral who asks, Desmond, do you think the repetition, fetishization, and obsession over past trauma is good or bad for the mental health of the descendants of those that suffered trauma? It's interesting. There's a second part. Oh, actually, the second question is for Lance from the same person.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And I don't think that there's one answer for that. I think for some people who are ready to process and think through their trauma, that could be a healthy way of doing it. I think the reality is that so many people are not really ready to deal with that trauma, and we don't have the requisite resources to support them through that process. And so oftentimes, this happens in my classes in social work all the time. We're asking Black folk to eviscerate themselves and to talk about trauma and to process trauma, which for some folks is okay, but then we leave them hanging, right? So they've told White folks that they're in pain and there's no one else to catch them or to support them or to help them think about next steps. And so I think that this has to be a multi-pronged approach. I think processing trauma is always good, but we have to think about strategies for individuals and groups.
Yeah, and that reminds me of a session I did here just a couple of weeks ago with Victoria Vilk from PEN America, who runs trainings for authors and writers, scholars increasingly on defense against the dark arts online, on online self-defense. And she's very careful about even this public session we did. We had to shape it, sculpt it around the question of reliving the trauma of these were two scientists, one at Columbia, one at the University of Maine, who dealt with a lot of incoming. And I guess there's that question always of, and how much of that's private, how much of that's public, where you share those stories or exploring solutions seems to be an interesting challenge too. So Science Cathedral also asked Lance about censorship. Well, should we implement censorship on what stories get told and how they get told? I mean, this gets really interesting in a hurry, of course, because it's like First Amendment stuff, there was a woman writing in the Sunday Times of London, really provocative columnist who's calling, disparaging what she called face mask Nazis. And that felt to me like there's certain things that feel like shouting a fire in a crowded restaurant or theater. And these tools are out there, and how do we, how does that play? Who gets to play?
Well, I think what's interesting too is, and this goes back to the project that I was talking about, Project Immerse, just briefly, is the challenge of where we're moving is things are going to become harder. It's going to become harder and harder to know what is real and what is not, what is true and what is not. And so I think on the one side of censorship, I mean, I think that's a huge conversation. Like, we could spend a lot of time talking about that. But I think what's interesting is, what's it going to look like when we start to work with machines? And some of the most effective deepfakes, deepfake is, a machine is literally, whether it's deepfake video, or it could be done with audio, and it's emulating, it's creating us here, it's
Right.
taking us, and it's manipulating us in some way, and or it's done with audio, where you can manipulate a voice to make it sound like someone else. Or probably one of the more dangerous areas is in text, and the difficulty of being able to tell what is actually, real or not. And so I think censorship on the one side, in terms of what stories are told, and if I could table that for a moment, I think what's interesting in regards of how we're rushing into this world of effectively deep fakes, or shallow fakes, or cheap fakes, which are done through manipulation of, editing, slowing something down. You saw Speaker Pelosi last year, there was a thing that they said that she looked drunk, and they just slowed the speed of the actual video, to people using, Lens by Snapchat or Snap Camera, being able to put on AR filters and become someone else, even if it's rudimentary at this point. So that level of being able to tell what's real or not real, some of the challenges that we face are really around policy-based issues, and policy is behind the curve on this. And so really it's up to citizens to start to be able to identify when these happen, and then maybe think about the sources of where things are coming from. So I think if you think about one side, where technology is racing towards, and then you think about this issue of censorship in and around stories, it's just this really, very tense kind of debate, because we're talking about censorship based on human written stories or human written assets. What does censorship look like for machine written things or machine created things? And where does that sit, ethically, or what do we do with it politically? And so I think we haven't even figured out censorship on the human side, let alone what is it potentially going to be on the machine side. So that project that received a seed grant from the Brown Institute is really kind of an anthology series. It's kind of like a Black Mirror anthology series, but unlike Black Mirror, which is very dystopian and you kind of feel ultimately depressed at the end of an episode, we thought, what if we, and Nick Fortuno has this theory of change. He's an adjunct at Columbia and he's a game designer. He has this theory of change that's around this idea of attract and educate. And we're exploring this idea of, if we entertain, if we kind of grab you with the entertainment side, can we catch you on the other side with some educational elements? And so the idea is that you interact with like deep fake characters, and it's told through Zoom, and kind of uses web pervasive technologies like Miro, which is a collaborative board, which I can show a little bit later. And it takes those, and then it kind of pulls back the curtain and says, hey, everything that you were interacting with here, 90% of it was created by a machine or co-created by a machine. Here's how it was done. Here's how a deep fake is made. Here's what a shallow fake is, or a cheap fake. And the idea is to kind of allow people to experience the technology, so they're not, it demystifies it in a certain way. So I don't have an explicit answer around the censorship. It's more that I have additional questions about censorship, but yeah. I feel like we're at a really interesting crossroads.
We sure are. I remember the New Yorker podcast, they interviewed Daniel Kahneman, Nobel Prize winner in economics, for his Thinking Fast and Slow, decades of research on how we perceive and misperceive risk and stuff. And he was talking about how he, Mr. Slow Thinking, Mr. Deliberative, missed completely the scale of the pandemic. He said he was about to fly to France I think in March, and he made the decision not based on logic or anything. It was some completely different. Oh, sorry, we had a little freeze or something there for a minute. Can you hear me okay? Here we are, interconnected digitally by a system that someone was just slowing. Just kidding. You know, so I used to teach at Pace University a course called Blogging a Better Planet, and one of the exercises I developed for students was I called it a backtrack journal, where some piece of information that captures their attention. Where did it come from? And take it all the way back, step by step, from some tweet to something to the. And it felt like a cool practice, but even I get fooled still. I was confirmation biased into supporting something recently that was, you know, it was fakery, and I have to catch myself constantly. So it just feels to me like this is a huge frontier, and the tools we're using are designed to take us in the wrong direction. Let's get to the question of some specifics, and I was hoping maybe. Lance, you could lead us through, show us a little bit of what one of these experiential projects looks like, and Desmond will get into a couple of things too.
Sure, I think, and I'm excited too to be able to share this with you, Desmond, because we haven't had a chance to talk in a bit. But this notion of like when everything went down into quarantine and we had to teach or adjust to a virtual space in terms of the end of the semester, I became really fascinated with how you know, some of the modalities of interactivity and the pedagogical challenges of working with screens and multiple platforms, and started experimenting in a lot of ways with how I could make the classroom more dynamic, and I could allow the students to interact with each other. And one of the ways that we were doing that, predominantly at Columbia, we use Zoom. But the other tool that I started to explore that I've been using for quite some time is called Miro, and it is a kind of a whiteboarding tool. And the way that it works is it's collaborative, real time, and you can have upwards of about, they say about 200 people on it. I've done it with large groups, upwards of about 150 or so, but it worked really well in an interesting way to do things with my students. And I've been using it in my own creative practice. I have a project that I've been working on that's called Where There's Smoke, which I made with my father, who had stage 4 colon cancer and passed away. But it's kind of part memoir, part interactive documentary, immersive theater piece with a little bit of an escape room in it. But it's really about grief, and it's about end of life and how to have conversations around it. And so I started using Miro and Zoom to create performances around that. And I started bringing the tools into the classroom and allowing students to interact with it. And so I'm going to share my screen, if I could, just here, and I'm going to show you what the experience and Where There's Smoke looks like. It's kind of a cross between almost like an electric literature project that's like hyperlinking mixed with like digital art, but it has branching kind of narratives, and people move through it in breakout rooms. So the way that we're talking now, you could imagine that we're all navigating through a shared space. And what I love about it is the fact that you traverse it in a way that is expansive. So people get lost in it all the time. And like if I was at a music festival with a bunch of friends and I said, oh, where are you? And they said, oh, I'm over here by the stage, this stage. And somebody's like, I'm over here. And then you find your way, you wayfind through a space, but then afterwards you have conversations about, well, what did you encounter? I saw this, where were you? Which is a very interesting thing that you see within immersive theater, in particular, like productions like Sleep No More has a very strong component around that. And so this here is, let me see here, I'm gonna share my screen. So that's that. Sorry, it's the first time I've done it with this. So can you all see that? I assume so.
Yep. Yeah,
okay,
I just
great.
posted it up.
Okay, great. So so what we have here is it makes use of rich media, the animated GIFs and so forth and so on, and fragmented text. And it kind of tells the story of my dad and his diagnosis with cancer, like the first time that he didn't tell us he actually had it. And then it plays with an underlying kind of mystery where when I grew up in a firefighting household. My dad was a volunteer firefighter for over 20 years, an amateur fire scene photographer. Shot thousands of pictures of things in various states of burning. And there were 2 devastating fires in my youth. And for over 30 years, I've always wondered if my dad actually had set them. And so when my dad became very ill, he granted me the opportunity to sit with him and interview him. And so what I ended up doing was I ended up interviewing him for close to 20 hours. And he said that I could ask him anything. And so that became the framework for what became a piece that kind of tells the story of his illness, and it stemmed from like a lack of empathy and care that we experienced when he was diagnosed. And so folks can move through this. And what's interesting about this is it's all kind of layered. So you have editorial permission and you can move things around and uncover different elements. But then it also has moments that it prompts you to reflect on certain things. And so people will come in and they'll reflect on something that they wish they had said to somebody, something related to a moment of heartbreak or a memory or something that they felt or they regretted not saying. And then it moves into, folks kind of creating these almost memorials for other people. And what's really powerful about it is it's done in a collaborative environment. And people kind of investigate this board, and then it has fragments that come from the storytelling that I did with my father, which are a series of slides, and you hear us talking together. And what's been really very powerful and profound about this, and I've been working with Dr. Rita Sharon at the medical school and the narrative medicine program, is looking at building ways that this type of interactivity can come into some of the COVID programs that they're doing currently, in addition to being able to be used as a tool to have ways to explore kind of end of life conversations. Sorry, I'm just like new to this, so I thought I stopped sharing, but that's very immersive. But I didn't. It didn't stop sharing there. But the idea was, and if I could just close on this really quickly, and why it's interesting in terms of using it in a classroom, is I've come to learn certain modalities of it where it's really powerful to do a shared sense-making experience where it's done with just people leaving their mics open but not communicating. So you can hear sounds coming from all over and you watch people do collective meaning and sense making together. It's been really interesting in terms of thinking about how sound then is brought into it. What's powerful about it is when we're doing it together, we're not looking at each other. We can hear each other's voices and we're kind of almost disembodied, which then has created really interesting challenges in terms of cognitive load and information architecture, like how you parse information to students. But then the other side of it that's really beautiful is when they finish, you can go through and you can do all these really amazing, almost like presentations out of it. So what they make, you can put a frame around and you can move through it and have them present. So we've been doing with the School of Professional Studies, we've been doing a futures program with high school students this summer. And we've been using this, and they've been designing around the Green New Deal. And they've been building out future artifacts and using speculative design to imagine what futures will, dealing with climate displacement, dealing with food economies, looking at how to create awareness around the Green New Deal. And they do a variety of art-driven things, but they're rooted in speculative design. And so I'd be very excited about the collaborative space as a way to kind of break from the challenges that we face with like Zoom and thinking about how we can have more dynamic kind of learning environments.
So I'd love to hear Desmond's reaction. Certainly that brings to mind lots of possibilities. And just to give you one of them, a week ago, the session on here was about story maps, the SRE's story map as a tool it was about map making as storytelling. And they've just added sound to that for the first time. And there are teachers who are utilizing it and trying to figure out how to get to this point of having your community story envisionable, having the data access, expertise access, and conversation too. The thing that's missing there, I think, so far is that interactivity. I keep saying, well, can you morph like story maps with what what Peter Coleman's people do, the difficult conversations lab, or how do you build it in as you're just describing? I think, this sort of, to make it a solution space and a community cohesion space. I don't know. So Desmond, I'm talking too much. I'd like to hear you thinking about this.
Yeah, I think that it is so impressive and such a great use of these new adaptive technologies, right? Because I think about the communities that I work in, and I also focus on expressions of grief and how young people kind of narrate grief in digital space. And I think there are a number of issues that make it complicated. Number one is that there's an issue of interpretation and being able to understand and unpack context. And I feel like this particular experience allows one to be the driver of how one would understand and interpret grief through their own experiences, and being able to link words with pictures and with video and audio. These are things that young people care a tremendous amount of, about. But oftentimes we are only seeing a very small slice of a grief expression and unable to connect it to a broader narrative or other experiences, or being able to connect with other young people who are going through similar experiences, but maybe in a different space, right? So what would it mean for a young person from the South Side of Chicago to be in this collaborative space with a young person from Iraq? And how might they have similar trajectories of grief and trauma, but be able to connect around some particular themes that may emerge from this experience? And so I think that it's a really powerful tool. And I think, as a researcher, it's oftentimes hard to see the connections between grief expressions and actions. So for the work that I do, I'm very concerned about what happens when grief sits too long in digital space. And so there's a lot of expression happening, particularly as it relates to COVID-19, as it relates to anti-Black racism that we are dealing with in this current moment, that then will have impact in health, in mental health, in violence. We're seeing upticks in violence all across the country nowadays. What does it mean to connect these real world expressions with action? So I think that this becomes one of the ways in which we can actually do something about it. And I'm interested, as a social worker, what would it mean for social workers to be in digital space, but to do this as an exercise with clients and communities? Because it may also help us to think more carefully and more thoughtfully around the types of resources we can provide, because we don't have the digital piece to help us consider the next treatment modality. But this kind of tool could alleviate some of those challenges as well.
If I could, Andy, just real quick, Desmond, I think what's really interesting too is there's ways that we're playing with the API for Miro, and there's things that you can do with it that are interesting in the sense that you can register where a click happens on the board. So you can know, you in an anonymous way, you can see how things travel or where interest sits. You can make use of the system clock. You can also capture certain things through the metadata that's written, because you can write on Post-it notes and you can write all throughout the board. So, and there's a really dynamic kind of activity stream that sits on the side. So we'd love to have an offline conversation with you about maybe there's some things that we could experiment with together, kind of returning to some of the work that we had done previously, or just looking at different ways, or just even sharing more of what we've learned with just experimentation that might be of interest.
Awesome.
Well, that shows you again, and you both are into this too, Desmond, particularly the research end here too. So it's not just the applicability, the tool, the solutions, but also studying the process and thinking actively about all those ramifications. That same commenter posted a relevant comment. I love the project. I'm wondering about concerns of the record becoming permanent. Can people go back and erase? How's the privacy kept safe? Which is kind of, I think, part of what you were all just talking about, making sure the grief, that you're not exacerbating things or amplifying things in ways that were interesting. He actually hears.
Andy, the board at the end dies. When the project dies, the board dies. So it was very symbolically in terms of like the way the story and the experience ends. So there's a whole permissioning thing that you can do with those boards.
The same person posted this. I would refer you to Dr. Bonanno's work on PTSD on descendants of Palestinian and Jewish trauma survivors. He found that the trauma was bigger on the descendants than on the actual people. That's pretty fascinating. I don't know this work, but it makes some interesting points too about this trauma now, the flavors of trauma, and how you can work forward through some of these things. The next steps part, to me, I want to get back to sort of the basics of social work too, which seems to me so much at the center here. Social work. And I was in a very non-digital place, although everyone there is on WhatsApp, in India a couple of years ago, in rural India. And I learned about these accredited social health activists. There are a million of them in India now. A million villages have women. Most of them are from the local community who are kind of the sensory apparatus for the public health, so that they're in the village. They're mainly there to track prenatal care, to incentivize women when they get pregnant to make sure they see a doctor and the like. I was there on a project trying to test cleaner cooking methods. If you make that an incentive, so can you get more buy-in of families who have pregnant women in the household? But it was this network, this sensory apparatus aspect that was so interesting. I don't even know if they fall under the Western definition of social work, but it was this idea of a two-way interface between expertise and, in this case, village scale needs. It seems so, and there's some pretty good work. If people can go back to this or just get in touch with me later, I can send some links to some of the research on this. And it just felt like, I guess, so what are the properties you want, whether it's digital or not? As we get here, we have another 20 minutes. What is the dream? What is the vision for, whether it's to deal with trauma or to boost resilience? What is the direction of success? And it's obviously not a destination as much as a direction. Maybe Desmond, could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I think it's really about disrupting the status quo. And I want to harp on this point that you've been alluding to, is really about who gets to be an expert in these spaces. I do a lot of thinking around expertise and inclusion. And in my own lab, one of the things that we've done is that we have hired young people that are from the communities that we are observing on various social media platforms to be domain experts, right? And so oftentimes when we name or qualify someone as a domain expert, they have X amount of degrees, teach at X elite institution, have a set of experiences that are, broad and vast. What we know to be true is that the young people from the communities in which we are observing are the experts on their lived experience and know way more than we could ever know around digital communication and the impact of communication on the lived experience. And that was something that really blew up how we applied artificial intelligence, how we interpreted data, how we viewed the data, the ethics of our practices has all been informed by young people. So what does it mean to center and privilege young people? And I also want to make clear that oftentimes we think about doing these things as like a liberal checklist. Like, I'm a liberal person. I want to hire young Black youth to do X, Y, and Z. It's much bigger than that, right? Because you also have to be also to understand that white supremacy and racism infiltrate all aspects of daily life, all aspects of how young people experience the world and see the world, and also in terms of how we work with young people. And so, in our early days, we made a lot of mistakes because we thought, if we just hire young people, that our work is going to be so much more valid and so much more ethical, and we didn't consider their life. They didn't consider what was going on in their world and why they would want to be involved in the first place. And so I think that the goal is to have a set of processes that are inclusive, that are open, and that are flexible, and that are led by young people as well. And so that has been kind of a major shift in our work. And so when you show those women, it reminded me of kind of where we need to be in social work in terms of hyper inclusivity, and to understand that the way in which we think about who gets to be at the table no longer works. Right? What does it mean to throw out old practices? What does it mean to disregard methodologies and to be true to the lived experiences of community members? And I think that is a hard pill to swallow, but we have this moment. Why not utilize this moment where we are today? Everyone's reading or trying to read, to really put our money where our mouth is. And so for me, success is a ever evolving thing. And I try not to get too caught up in that, because it also calls upon ideas of success that aren't necessarily from my community. And so what does it mean to let some of that go, right? So I'm in a process of unlearning notions of white supremacy that dictate how I operate as a researcher. And what does it mean to kind of let go of ideas of rigor and methodology to actually just truly embrace the moment and what's happening in communities? It doesn't mean that we throw away structures and practices, but just really to question how we develop those structures and practices. And so I'm not, answering your question about success, because I think that I want to see what it means to be successful from a different angle nowadays.
Well, the only other element I'd add to that is scale. Like the only other way to get scale is to liberate the capacity. I think about that in kind of the context of like climate resilience, or you have COVID-19, which isn't going to be a diminished risk until many, many more communities are fully engaged in a set of practices that work in their communities. And vaccination, when that we've done 5 different sessions on here, I think, about vaccination communication, that there's no way you can get at these issues. I agree completely on that. And I think journalism is going through the same really ugly learning experience right now, with letting go, with not being the provisioner. And, I was a blogger the last 9 years at the New York Times, and I felt that was a step toward a more interrogatory, exploratory form of journalism. I felt it was right for the moment, but it was not right for the New York Times. They never got it. So, and now they're faced with this epic, brittleness between them and the communities, various communities. So scale as well. I guess that must drive Lance too. Even you came through the Hollywood and TV enterprise, and your community, that community too, is facing epic challenges now alone. But getting at these outcome-oriented uses of this technology feels like liberate it.
Well, I think some of the challenges, a lot of the times people look at data and they'll think data holds all the answers, right? And so in a lot of cases with like storytelling, it's being used for risk mitigation, right? And it's crippling certain types of expression. And I think that when I look at some of the challenges of how you try to measure things, I often find that the success that comes from the work comes from, very much letting go of what that process is. And what's amazing about it is the surprises that you find that you would have never even thought of in the first place, and just how folks who step into it can be empowered within it. Even the example that I gave with where there's smoke, I think what makes that a powerful experience is, yes, there's a vulnerability there, and it's a personal story, but the vulnerability creates a jumping off point where other people can be personal with their own stories, right? So how do we hold space? Dr. Sharon calls it a clearing. The narrative medicine program calls it a clearing. And how do you create these clearings that allow people to feel safe within them? And what does that look like in terms of digital placemaking? What does that look like in terms of, are there parts of the practice of placemaking that we can bring into digital environments that would allow us to think about how we maneuver through a digital space. Is there a certain way that you're welcomed? Is there a certain degree of questions or conduct or context to that space? How do you construct them? And I think what's exciting about the work that SafeLab does and that Desmond and his colleagues do is, you're letting those voices, it's like they're designing what it can be, right? They're building out that space and doing it together. And I know from some of the work that I've done, like, when youth is really engaged in something, they're a conduit to so many other people in communities. They bring other people to the table in really dynamic ways. So I think a lot of it is like, how do you get out of the way of it, right? So a lot of the times you're trying to figure out ways to try to make things seamless. And emergent technology is incredibly difficult, because when I did an installation of Where There's Smoke, the ultimate compliment that I got was, I did a 1,400 square foot installation at Tribeca, the film festival last year. You went into a storefront, you went through a burned out space, you interacted with these enchanted objects, you put them down on the table, and it unlocked narrative, and the room changed, and it was magical. And somebody said, oh, well, it seemed really low tech, which I thought was an amazing compliment, because it was so incredibly high tech, but how do you get out of the way and allow the technology to serve what's happening, and it not to be some shiny object that you stumble over or that you let dictate where you're headed? And sometimes that can be a real challenge, because people are intimidated by the technology, or B, they're so drawn to it, it's intoxicating to them. So, but I think finding ways to remove yourself from that process, I echo what Desmond's saying. I'm always so inspired by the work of SafeLab and so into what the team there does, because I love what Columbia has in terms of the brilliant minds that are doing all these amazing things throughout the university. And it's like being able to drop in and get different perspectives, to be able to have outliers come into things. Like when we collaborated, Desmond, I think it was one of the first times the School of the Arts ever collaborated with the School of Social Work, and I would love to just see more collaborations like that. And because I think it's the same thing, and mixing in folks who are from outside the university and practitioners and youth. And I don't know, it just feels like we need more voices in order to try to solve some of these complex challenges.
Yeah, as I said, I started here just about a year ago, and I keep stumbling into places that I could probably have spent decades here in the old days and never even knew existed. So I guess there's promise that we can find each other. Angela Rasmussen at the School of Public Health, the virologist, has been on this program multiple times because of her work on social media around COVID-19. And I guarantee you, she and I never would have connected before. And she said her Twitter following went from 200 people January to 150,000 now. And
Wow.
that, so she was on the program I did on self-defense against harassment and the like, because she's already endured many troubles. So the building a network, an intellectual network and action network, so that people know, not just here too at Columbia, but communities can engage with each other and engage with expertise on their terms. That feels like, to me, the most important frontier right now. This is after 35 years of me telling stories, hey, you should pay attention to climate change because it's important, and here's why. That's not the source of resilience at the scale we would need going forward. And even innovation, the same thing. So I'm really glad you're doing what you're doing. And when you add to that the again, history of people being blocked from being part of the conversation by whatever means, by race, by all these questions, lack of digital access. Those are key challenges going forward. So I'd like to sort of get toward a close with some action points. I think it's pretty clear that there's things we could work on together that will be more valuable by doing so together, whether it's me helping propagate the model you're working on with others or bringing in expertise as needed It's good that I guess I got you two together because you got caught up on some project that you hadn't been caught up on. But what would be a next step? Where do we go from here? One of my first conversations actually it was the first Sustain What back March 15th with Jeremy Zalar, who was a New York Times blog designer who I worked with on .earth, then he went into government. He was in government at digital.gov, like how do you make taxpayer supported websites work for the public? He said, everyone you talk to, you should say, what's something you could do tomorrow that would be different than today as a result of what we just learned? So I don't know what comes to mind. It sounds like there might be a couple of things in your heads as we come to a close here, but maybe Desmond, is there some action step I can help you with, or that who's not in the room here? Actually today there's no women, which is a rarity on this platform. But and students, getting a young person, as you said, the leadership is not at the top anymore. So what would be something I could do? Another session, another iteration of this that might help, or where do we go from here?
Yeah, I would just love to see cross-cutting conversations between young people and adults around a particular set of issues, right? So those conversations, so oftentimes what happens is that we have a youth-focused conversation and then a practitioner-focused conversation, but rarely are we in conversation together where we ask the same questions, where we can hear each other and see each other think through the challenges and the benefits and opportunities. And so I would love to see that happen. But I'll also love to see us think through, what we can do together. But because, I think a part of the challenge is that we're all kind of zoomed out, teched out as well. And so I think, thinking of really fun and creative opportunities like the one that Lance has identified and is using is a nice space, because I would mind spending time doing something like that, and I would do that over another chat. Right. Because, we're on these things from 9 to 5 every day. So I think that those are some really cool opportunities for us.
I do too. And there are models out there that I still feel like haven't made the rounds enough. This is not youth-centered, but it's a really important model. I think that a very stodgy institution, 100 years old, the American Geophysical Union, 6 or 7 years ago, launched Thriving Earth Exchange, which is essentially a match.com for communities at risk. In this case, the risks are, hydrological, like flooding or landslides. So you got a landslide problem. How do you find a geomorphologist? And they're trying to build that landscape. And here's the scale thing. They've only done about 150 in a world that needs tens of thousands of connections between communities and expertise. In that case, real expertise on, landslides or erosion or flooding. And just think about that in the context of the issues of like violence or urban design. Or I loved Kibera in Nairobi. I was there a long time ago, and they were doing this Kibera map for a community-generated map. So the community was identifying which paths in the slum were unsafe for women and the like. And that's my thing. I'm just a connector. I'm just like, hey, have you seen this? So that's my job going forward. And I'd like to keep following up with you on next steps. And I love the idea of doing an exercise, maybe an immersive journey, if we can figure out a way to do that, one that would be a public one, maybe not as deeply sensitized or maybe not a grief-oriented one, but something in the solutions end as sort of a test case in how to explore this and have the kids do it. I've had 2 or 3 sessions on here where students, they were like grad students from McGill. They ran sessions on this platform. I step into the green room and they do it. So there's ways for us to do that too. Hey, sorry.
If I could, the one thing that I think is an action item to be really cool to do is I think get together with a bunch of youth, adults, whoever it is, and do some speculative design thing where we imagine the potential of what a future world could be, so that we're not tied in any of the rules that currently exist, but we have the ability to imagine what could be, and to do that in a collaborative way where we're kind of mapping it out almost, or designing it in a way like with some of the tools that I showed. And we're doing it in groups and rotating people through and sharing the findings and allowing people to see it. And then they're crafting kind of stories around what that is or what that world is. I think could be really exciting.
I agree. I like that idea. If you Google for the hashtag future slider and my name, Revkin, you'll see this is more of a mapped approach to risk reduction. This is more like, again, geophysical risk. It's wildfires. And you'll see there's the capacity to do this. And I'm working with some folks, World Resources Institute, National Geographic, to see if we can make it happen as an envisioning platform. This is just a hint. There's actually an organization out there that will, for free, help communities plan for wildfire all across the West, and only, I think, as of a year ago, about 24 communities that signed up. I think that could be more than that. And that was, these are mostly physical, face-to-face workshops, and they know how to do it. They know the steps to lead a community toward resilience. Here at Columbia, we're doing a managed retreat meeting next year, the second one. And so much of this has to do with climate justice, because communities that are, the people in a community that are most at risk are, of course, the least advantaged, often of color. And so how do you normalize that capacity using tools online? Feels like a good step going forward. Hey, we're at the end of the hour. The church bells here in my little village have chimed. And I'm up the Hudson River, where my wife is a village trustee. So she's engaged with the future of our tiny community. And thank you so much, Desmond Patton and Lance Weiler, for playing along and thriving online. You've made me feel both hesitant and maybe a little optimistic about making next steps that can actually do something. It's a very noisy environment. These tools can be used for disadvantage as well as advantage, and we have to keep that in mind every day. It's not an even landscape. So this is Sustain What? It's a project of the new Initiative on Communication and Sustainability at the Earth Institute of Columbia University. And the goal is to make information matter and to make connectivity matter. So much of it today leads us in troubling directions, but we're at a point where we've clearly identified possibilities going forward that can lead us toward a more inclusive, safer, resilient, creative world for everybody. So stay tuned. On Wednesday, Jeff Shaman, an epidemiologist, will be here, I think, with a couple of teachers who have developed an app for outbreak tracking. They did this before the outbreak, so students get to be epidemiologists, and we'll learn more of that. And onward into the future, next Monday will be another Thriving Online session. Thank you all. You can get in touch with me with ideas by looking at the scrolling bar at the bottom and get my information there. And share this with anyone else when we're done. This becomes an archive link wherever you've been watching. So share it, get in touch, and stay safe as you can. Stay as sane as you can. And thank you, Desmond. Thank you, Lance.